Hello, today we'll be talking about the Baroque in Northern Europe. Much of the artwork that we're going to be looking at is Lutheran, but I'm going to begin with some examples of some Catholic artwork. The work of Peter Paul Rubens is what we're going to start with, and he was a Flemish Baroque painter, and he was very wealthy and famous and well-liked during his lifetime. He was a knight, a diplomat, he was a father. He would often have people read aloud to him while he worked, and he spoke many languages, so he was sort of an all-around success. His paintings are colorful, sensual, and full of movement, and they're also famous for always featuring these very robust characters. You can see the figures all have a sort of same build. That's very characteristic of Rubens. Even his figure of Christ seems to be very well-fed and very muscular and defined. Like the artwork that we were looking at in the previous module, this is incredibly dramatic, and there's a sense of twisting motion throughout. But there's something a little bit more light about this than the artwork that we were looking at from Southern Europe. Although it's dramatic, it's not quite so mysterious, violent, and heavy as the artwork of Italy and Spain, which is very characteristic of the Northern European Baroque. A lot of movement, but not quite so much darkness as we saw before. This is one of my favorites by Rubens. It's the arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille, so it's literally just a painting about a woman getting off of a boat. But even so, he managed to make it incredibly dramatic and over the top. Those are supposed to be like different sprites and water nymphs frolicking down below the image of the woman getting off of the boat. And above, there's an angel announcing the fact that she's getting off of a boat. But don't lose sight of the fact that this is only just an image of a woman getting off of a boat. This heightened level of drama, though, is a perfect characterization of the Baroque. They managed to make even the common everyday occurrence seem completely dramatic and over the top. Let's discuss two ideas that are going to affect all of the artwork that we're about to look at. First is Calvinism, and Calvinism is a form of Protestantism that emphasized piety and humbleness and disdained drama and wealth. This is an offshoot of Lutheranism, and all of these religious movements that move away from Catholicism are all living in the legacy of the Protestant Reformation. Calvinism was very popular in Northern Europe at this time, so we're going to see in Northern Baroque Europe a lot of artwork that isn't religious in nature at all, because the religious movement of this time was quite simple and plain. The artwork, the majority of the small artworks that we see that aren't religious in nature and that are from what is known as the Dutch Republic during this time period, which is Northern Europe, were made to be purchased by a middle class. And the middle class was a relatively new invention during this time period. Because of an increase in trade, there was more money, and so more regular people were becoming wealthy enough to want to purchase artwork to put in their homes. The type of artwork that was often purchased by the middle class depicted non-religious scenes, but they were still scenes that were moralizing in nature. This, for example, which is a supper party, we have a woman feeding a man chicken, and everybody seems to be having a good time. However, there would have been a moralizing undertone behind an image like this. It would have been assumed that the lady feeding the guy chicken was probably a prostitute, and that everybody at the supper party was about to be seduced by sin, which would have, of course, supposed to, be something that you don't want. But this is also a pretty fun scene, so it's an appealing image, and even though it's moralizing and it's not overtly religious in nature, it's still enjoyable enough that it's something that people would want to have in their house. There is evidence that there were a lot of fairly successful female painters during this time period, but much of the history of their careers has been lost because they weren't as well respected by their peers, who were mostly male. We do have a solid account of the career of Judith Leyster. Here's one of her self-portraits. Her smile looks a little bit strained in this self-portrait, but as anybody who's tried to draw a self-portrait knows, it's hard to keep your face still in one pose, especially in a smile. In this self-portrait, though, she's depicted herself painting one of the scenes, the type of scenes that she's most famous for, which are just of a person having a good time. She's also extremely famous for these scenes of kids with animals. Remember, these paintings were made to appeal to a middle class, so many of the paintings that survive from this time period are just the sort of like common everyday images that one might want to have in their home. This is a very new development. Rembrandt van Rijn is a Dutch painter and printmaker, and he's quite famous. He's famous for his emotional self-portraits and the intense, lively way that he painted and drew, and also etched. What we have on the lower right is an etching. It's a form of printmaking that I'll discuss more in a second. Rembrandt was a very skilled and very gifted artist, and he was also a very poor businessman. So throughout his lifetime, he ran into a lot of financial trouble, and the sort of grief and trouble that he had to endure can be seen throughout his self-portraits. In his early self-portraits, he appears quite happy, and as he ages, he appears more and more wizened and troubled by age. This is one of his later self-portraits. In the background, you see a half circle. This might be a reference to a story by Vasari, a famous art critic, who described the highest level of skill of an artist as being the ability to freehand draw a perfect circle. So maybe Rembrandt was trying to display his virtuosity with this. If you look at the paint, it's very thickly applied, and this kind of thickly and expressively applied paint is very characteristic of Rembrandt and is relatively unseen among his peers. So it was a pretty a pretty innovative way of painting. Rembrandt is also famous for his etchings, and an etching is a form of printmaking that involves the use of corrosive acid to create lines. It's very much like an engraving, so there are lines on a copper plate that are printed onto paper, but instead of carving the lines by hand, the lines are carved by an acid. So in order to create an etching, you didn't have to be a skilled metal worker. All you had to do was know how to manipulate the acid correctly to get the depth of line that you wanted. On the left here we have a sheet of copper, and this is a protective coating that was used to coat the copper. Then the copper was scraped back into. So this darker brown is the coating, it's the color of the coating, and this needle is used to scrape away the coating to expose the copper. And then the copper is then bathed in acid, like this, to create the lines. Rembrandt was a very skilled etcher. This is his most famous etching. It's called Christ with the Sick Around Him, Receiving Children, but it's better known as the 100 Guilder print. When Rembrandt created this print, he was so proud of it and thought it was such a successful image that he tried to sell it for 100 guilders each. 100 guilders would have been the equivalent of a lot of money during that time period, probably in the thousands of dollars. And people laughed at him because they didn't think that any print would be worth that much money, or that anybody should have the audacity to try and sell an image that could be reproduced for such an incredible sum. It was moves like that that made him not a very successful businessman, and probably one of the reasons that he went into debt. I, however, would argue that this etching is actually far more beautiful than most of his paintings, although that could be because I prefer etching over painting in general. And I think that the depth of this and the sensitivity to detail and the gentle shifts from dark to light are far more compelling than what he was able to achieve in his paintings, but that's just me. Let's look at some of the paintings of Vermeer. Vermeer was a Dutch painter, and he is famous for the paintings that he did of the insides of houses and of middle-class people hanging out inside of houses. He died relatively young, and he left his wife and children in debt because he painted so incredibly slowly. He painted slowly, but he also painted incredibly beautifully, and his paintings are executed at an incredibly high level of detail. One would say that they might almost appear to be radiating light. They kind of look like they're photographic in nature. This is one of his more famous images, Girl with a Pearl Earring, that was turned into a book, that was turned into a movie starring Scarlett Johansson. How was he able to paint such realistic images? Many art historians believe that he painted using a camera obscura, which is a tool. It's like a box, and it works like a projector in which images can be projected from a light room into a dark room and then traced. Here are some images of how a camera obscura might actually work. So there is a very well illuminated image, and then through a series of mirrors and angle shifts, that same image can be projected upside down onto a flat surface and then painted. Many art historians suggest that Vermeer and other artists of this time period used a camera obscura to help them start out their paintings. In paintings like this, you can see why that theory was so widespread. The level of detail and perfection in proportion and in perspective is almost unrivaled. You can also imagine, looking at this, why Vermeer spent so long on his paintings. He sometimes would spend years on a single painting just trying to get every detail perfect. That would also make sense with the fact that Vermeer often would paint still lifes or the interiors of houses, because the lighting could be very carefully controlled, and that's what you would need in order to project something through a camera obscura. In this is a painting about painting, kind of like Las Meninas, which we saw last time, and it's famous for that reason. We have an artist, and he appears to be painting a woman, and then the painting itself is called Allegory of Painting, so it's a meditation on the nature of painting itself. A common theme during this time period was Vanitas, and Vanitas comes from the Latin vanitas, which means vanity. Vanitas paintings were meant to make the viewer reflect on the vanity of everyday life and with the passing nature of time. A typical Vanitas painting would include memento mori imagery. Memento mori is another Latin phrase. It means remember that you will die. And imagery that is associated with Vanitas and memento mori includes skulls and rotting fruit and things that are broken. In this one, we see a glass that's turned over, a walnut that's been opened, a skull, a violin, but no one's playing it. The music stopped. Maybe the person playing it is dead. Everything about it is supposed to make you reflect on the passing nature of time, including that clock in the foreground, the key. Images like this were incredibly popular during this time period because they were moralizing, but they were often very beautiful and luscious, like this one here with the flowers. But you could keep it in your house, and it could be a symbol of your good taste and your moral correctness, because you were obviously reflecting on the passing nature of life. Images like this, some art historians say, could also have been painted using a camera obscura, which would have helped the artists of this time period achieve that high level of perfection and detail. During this time period, too, we also see the rise of grand manor paintings, which we are going to elaborate on in future modules. Grand manor paintings are paintings that use ancient Greece and Rome as their subject, and they came to be one of the most well-respected genre of painting in Europe for 200 years. Here's an early grand manor painting called Et in Arcadia Ego. We have 3 figures. They're all dressed in sort of, pseudo-Greek Roman outfits, and they're looking at a stone that has something carved on it. Arcadia was this ancient Greek idea of a perfect place, and its et in Arcadia ego means I also exist in Arcadia, and the I that's being referred to here is death. So the idea that death is inescapable everywhere, even in paradise, which harks back to that Vanitas theme that we were referring to earlier, which was very popular during this time period. Finally, we're going to look at the Palace of Versailles. And the Palace of Versailles was built for Louis XIV, who is also known as Louis the Great, who also liked to be called the Sun King, or Louis the God-Given. He was the King of France, and he served as king longer than any other king of any other major European country. He is perhaps most famous for the construction of the Palace of Versailles. I have some images of Louis down here, and you can see that he was not a humble man. Here is a painting of him in which he's wearing his favored red-heeled shoes and exposing his calves, which were a part of his body that he was very vain of. A statistic I found says that he spent the equivalent of $5 million on buttons over the 54 years of his reign, which equals about $100,000 a year on buttons. So you can get a sense for his taste of excess. His taste of excess is so famous that he and the Palace of Versailles are commonly featured in popular culture. Marie Antoinette was one of his court, and you may have heard the phrase "let them eat cake." That's her. That's her with her cakes, and she was the one who's famed for having said it. This is the Palace of Versailles from above. You can see that it's not a small complex. In fact, it's huge. And here's the central palace itself. Here are the gardens that are associated with the palace. Courtiers would have lived on either side of it. The palace has over 700 rooms, 2,153 windows, and takes up 67,000 square meters of floor space, which is over 12 American football fields. But just to say it's huge, you can get lost in it. It's utterly enormous, and hundreds and thousands of people worked on its construction. I'm going to finalize here with just some other views of the palace and how incredibly beautiful and over the top it is. So when we were discussing Baroque architecture, I mentioned that it was gaudy, ornamental to the point of being grotesque and absurd. I think the Palace of Versailles is certainly that, but it's also incredibly impressive. And that concludes this lecture.